Hitler knows he will have to break us on this island or lose the war. If we stand up to him, all Europe may be free, and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit uplands. But if we fail, the whole world, including the United States, including all we have cared and known for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age, made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will say, this was their finest hour. This was a speech that Churchill gave on June 18th, 1940, only 2 weeks after the British had just rescued hundreds of thousands of troops from the beaches of Dunkirk, France. They rescued British troops, French troops, Canadian troops who were stranded there because they had been beaten back by the Germans, beaten through France, off the beaches, and retreating back into their homeland. Much of the world, at least the Western world, was wanting to give in, to compromise, to try to work with Hitler. And just 2 weeks after Dunkirk, during what was called the Battle of France, Churchill stood before Parliament and gave this speech. It was one of 3 speeches he had given in a short time, known as the Battle of France. And it was this speech, the third one, that he gave that finally was the rallying cry. That had finally broken through the fog, that had finally woken up the British people to recognize that they were in a moment where they must either stand or fall, as he said in the speech. And whenever I read that speech, it made me think about the time that we're living in. Because not to be melodramatic, but from studying culture and reading much current events and watching what's happening in the Western world, not just our area, I think that we are also in a time where we will either learn to stand or will fall. We're living in a time where, just as we saw this past week, abortion laws are being passed denying the personhood of a human being all the way up to the moment of birth, including if the mother is dilating. That child, that person, that fully formed, viable, sentient human being in the womb can be murdered via lethal injection. We saw that just this week. We've been seeing recently how anti-Semitic hate crimes have been on a sharp rise, whereas they had been on a decline for many years. They've been on a rise for 3 years in a row, to be exact. Erin Donahue was writing for CBS News, and she said, anti-Semitic crime spiked in New York City, home to the largest Jewish population outside Israel, in the weeks leading up to the Pittsburgh Massacre, referring to the Pittsburgh Massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue that killed 11 people. There were 31 anti-Semitic hate crimes reported in the first 28 days of October in the city, compared to 9 for the same period in 2017, a New York Police Department spokesman said. The Anti-Defamation League also released a report that found social media harassment targeting Jewish Americans increased around the 2018 midterm elections, and 2/3 of those online attacks were from people, not bots. Not only are hate crimes on the rise for Jewish people, but for Muslims as well. Sikh temples and so on have been attacked. Different racial groups, hate crimes against different racial groups is on the rise. Hate crimes against sexual minorities and so on is on the rise. Hate crimes are on the rise across the country. Not only this, but we're experiencing a crisis where it comes to gender. Not only because there are people who suffer with gender dysphoria, a real struggle, a real suffering, which we should have compassion for and offer help for, but the suffering is being further pushed by harmful narratives. You can come to my next breakout to hear more about that one. Gender confusion, which is also coming about with children. There's a young man named Desmond. His drag name is Desmond is Amazing, being touted around as a new young hero for the sexual revolution. He's an 11-year-old boy whose parents bring him around the country so that he can dance and drag. Recently, he was dancing in drag at a gay strip club. An 11-year-old boy. There's video evidence of him taking money from the crowd. A witness who was there wrote on Yelp, on the Yelp site for this club, "I left after seeing a child dance on stage for money at nighttime. This was on a Saturday night, and I've been feeling disturbed ever since." Like I said, I don't think it's dramatic to say we are at a stand or fall moment. We have an immigration crisis. We have a suicide crisis. In this time, we need Christians who are willing to stand up and courageously speak the truth. Courage is more necessary for Christians now than it has been for many years in Western society. Courage is necessary, first of all, because life is suffering. It's painful, it's hard. Especially the more righteous you attempt to live, the harder it will be. The more ambitious and the more that you try to radically follow God's calling on your life, the harder it will be. Because people, even people who call themselves well-intending, will tear you down. Life is suffering. You're going to need courage. You'll also need courage because slowly the church is being marginalized. America was once a society that, by and large, accepted Christian values. We could espouse Christian values. We could espouse Christian morality and even call our neighbors who may not be Christian to live according to Christian morality, and generally everybody agreed. This was the period of Christendom, as it's called. We no longer live in Christendom. It is no longer given that the major society, even our non-Christian neighbors, tend to agree with us on most of our values. We'll need courage because what is biblical values, what is Christian conviction, is being marginalized. More than that, it is becoming more and more contentious to simply hold those beliefs. We now live in a day where you will not be able to live by biblical convictions without running the risk of being called a bigot for simply submitting to God's word. We need Christians who are willing to courageously speak the truth, because speaking the truth is the most important thing in the world, as we're going to be unpacking. Let's begin by talking about what is courage. When awarding the Medal of Honor, President Ronald Reagan paused and asked, "Where did we find such men?" If you read the stories of recipients of the Medal of Honor, it does make you stop and sit back and ask, where did we find such men? Because the amount of courage, the amount of bravery and valor displayed in the kind of person who receives a Medal of Honor is a level of courage that causes everyone, regardless of political party, regardless of socioeconomic class, it causes all of us to stop and pause and admire and awe and wonder. Where did we find such men? This is the power of courage. This has been the power of courage for all of human history. Plato included courage as one of the four cardinal virtues. That means the four most important, the four highest virtues. Those being prudence, temperance, justice, and courage. All societies throughout human history, virtually every society, every religious persuasion, and so on, has held the virtue of courage very high, including Christianity. Aristotle, in his Nicomachean Ethics, wrote about courage, and he described courage as being the mean, or he means the middle point between shameful fear and brash recklessness. Courage is what he said is what lies between shameful fear and brash recklessness. Because on the one hand, you can be someone who is fearful, who shrinks back, who doesn't step up to the challenge, who doesn't answer the call, or where else it may be. That is what he would describe as shameful fear. At the other end of the spectrum is recklessness, brash recklessness. This is what we would look at as sheer fearlessness. Fearlessness is not the same thing as courage, because we can look at all kinds of examples of fearlessness. We can look at a criminal who robs a store, who holds up a bank, who attacks a person. And to a certain extent, that criminal is practicing fearlessness, right? We can look at a terrorist who hijacks a plane, who brings guns into everyday society where they do not belong to cause all kinds of harm. right? And to a certain extent, that terrorist is practicing fearlessness, but none of us would call it courage. Courage exists in between shameful fear and brash recklessness, and it is courage rather than just fearlessness whenever it is done upon the basis of a deep value or for a righteous cause. This is what courage is. A person behaves courageously when he or she chooses a course of action based upon a certain set of values or ideals against immense pressure to follow an alternative. That's my definition of courage. Therefore, courage is doing what is right when you are urged to do what is wrong. It is doing what is hard when you want to take the easy way out. It is telling the truth when you are tempted to lie. Courage can take on different forms. Where we see courage practiced on the battlefield, where we see soldiers who run towards the sound of the gunfire instead of away, we call that valor. We call that bravery. That's courage. Where we see someone like William Wilberforce, who in the late 1700s and early 1800s, as a single figure, almost for his entire career, stood against the African slave trade. He stood against slavery, against blacks in the English Empire. Wilberforce fought for 30 years. For his entire career, he fought to end the atrocious evil of the slave trade, a victory that he did not see until days before his death. Nevertheless, he endured, he persevered. Where we see courage as perseverance, we call it endurance. We call it fortitude. We can also see courage in someone like Martin Luther King Jr., who, despite immense pressure to be silent or to lie, spoke. He was a preacher. He had no weapon but his word. He spoke against injustice. He spoke for human dignity for all people, against immense pressures and temptations to do the opposite. Whenever we see courage displayed in this way, we call it integrity. We call it honesty. We call it moral courage. And specifically, this is the last kind of courage that we're talking about today. This moral courage, this speaking whenever it's hard, when it would be a lot easier to stay silent, to answer honestly whenever somebody asks us something that's relevant to our Christian faith. And the answer, which might be biblically true and yet politically incorrect, is hard to give. It would be easier just to shy out of it. But it takes integrity to answer honestly, to practice moral courage. This is the kind of courage that we see in Scripture. In fact, we see all three of these types of courage in Scripture throughout the entire Bible. The Bible is full of exhortations to courage. It's something that we overlook, and I think that it is to the great detriment to it is a strike against the health and vitality of the church that we have overlooked the Bible's call for God's people to be courageous. It comes about in a lot of different forms, but if you simply search the phrase, be strong and courageous, which I did this morning, I found 15 different verses where that phrase, or almost that exact same phrase, is found throughout Scripture. Be strong and courageous. Deuteronomy 31:6, be strong and courageous. Do not fear or be in dread of them. For it is the Lord your God who goes with you. He will not leave you or forsake you. Joshua 1:6, be strong and courageous. For you shall cause this people to inherit the land I swore to their fathers to give them. Daniel 10:19, and he said, O man greatly loved, fear not, be at peace with you. Be strong and of good courage. And as he spoke to me, I was strengthened. And I said, let my Lord speak, you have strengthened me. And there are many others that use different phrases, but I'm just showing you 15 examples of just one phrase, be strong and courageous. Because we also see the call to courage come about in the form of take heart. Very often that's what the Bible will say, take heart or take up courage or be strong. In John chapter 16, verse 33, Jesus said to his disciples, I have said these things to you that you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but take heart. That's a call to courage. But take heart, I have overcome the world. In Proverbs 28, verse 1, it describes the righteous as being as bold as a lion. Think of David defeating Goliath. Think of Joshua leading Israel to the promised land, defeating her enemies again and again and again, leading what was looked back upon as Israel's greatest generation. Consider Peter and John testifying before the Sanhedrin after being beaten, after being threatened. The Bible is full of calling to courage. The Bible describes God's people as a kind of people who should be lion-hearted, because that is what courage is, to be lion-hearted. The question is, where does it come from? It would be easy for us to think that courage is just a natural born trait, something that our heroes have that maybe not all of us have, or they got an extra measure of it that most of us don't get. That's how we think when we look back to someone like Washington. That was a courageous figure. When we look back to someone like Martin Luther, like MLK, we think, well, they just had this natural born gift of courage. But here is the wonderful, encouraging secret about courage, which is this: we all have the potential for world-changing courage. That's not hyperbole, it's not an overstatement. We all, every man and woman, we all have the potential for world-changing courage. Here's the key: you have to know where to look. You have to know where to look. Because we have this faulty kind of thinking about courage. And I think it kind of goes back to that faulty sort of thinking that courage is something that's just a natural born trait. We have this idea that courage comes from within. Think of Mulan. We got a lot of 90s kids in here, right? or wait, a lot of you guys might be 2000s kids, right? Think of Mulan. I'm sure a lot of you guys have seen Mulan. Early in the movie, she sings this song, I think it's called Reflections. She's looking into a pool, and she sings, she asks this question: when will my reflections show who I am on the inside, right? And throughout the course of the movie, the adventures that she goes through, everything that she accomplishes, finally by the end of the movie, her reflection shows. She was a valiant warrior. She was a courageous warrior, right? She had valor and bravery. But there's an assumption beneath that story, and it's the kind of assumption that I think we all have when it comes to courage, valor, integrity, which is that it's something that's on the inside of you that just simply needs to be brought out, right? Because that's the whole point. When will my reflection show who I am on the inside? So the assumption is that from the beginning of the movie, that's who she was on the inside, and by the end of the movie, we get to see on the outside who she was on the inside. That's wrong. That is not where courage comes from. The world tells you to find courage by looking inward, but the gospel tells us to find courage by looking upward. Courage is not found by looking within, but by looking without. It is not found by looking inward, but by looking upward. Specifically, by looking upward to Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is the source of our courage. In Hebrews chapter 12, in verse 1 and 2, it says, "Let us run with endurance." Remember, that's one of the terms for courage. It's a persevering courage. "Let us run with endurance the race." The word for race there is agon. It's a Greek word, not just for race, but for any type of extremely intense physical struggle. "Let us run with endurance the race that lies before us, keeping our eyes on Jesus, the source and perfecter of our faith." If our faith causes us to live courageously, if our faith causes us to run the agon, the struggle, the race with endurance, and if Jesus is the source and perfecter of our faith, then Jesus is the ultimate example. He goes beyond example. He is the archetype of what courage is. And we discover courage, and courage is infused into us and then brought out of us by looking towards Him. We run the race and we endure in the race by looking towards Him who endured His own race. As the author says, for the joy that lay before Him, He endured. He endured the cross, despising the shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Jesus is the brave warrior battling the powers of sin and death. He is the athlete, the champion, persevering through the opposition of the world. He is the prophet who refused to step down when threatened to be silent. Jesus is the ultimate victor king whose work accomplished our salvation and then invites us to walk the noble road of courage along with him. Jesus, who endured the cross, calls his disciples to take up their cross with him. Friends, there is no option to live a Christian life that is not a courageous life. There is no option to live a life of discipleship that excludes a cross. Courage that comes like a fire in your belly. That's what I want for us. Courage that burns like a fire in your belly only comes from fixing your eyes on Jesus. So fix your eyes on him. Look upward and then run. Then struggle. Then stand. Then speak. Once again, I think that the church has severely mishandled this topic. And we treated courage as something that is merely a psychological antidote to fear or anxiety, right? Like, your life isn't going well, so you need to read some encouraging Bible verses, and it'll make you feel better, right? Courage may have a certain psychological aid to it, but most of the time, what courage is acting appropriately in the face of fear. Courage is not so concerned about what you're thinking or feeling as much as it is concerned with acting and doing. It's not so much about being a psychological antidote to fear as it is about changing our actions and behaviors. So this is very literal. Look upward and then run. It's very literal whenever the Bible calls us to be strong and to be courageous. Courage is action-oriented. So let's talk about that, action. How can we begin to act with courage and begin to develop it within ourselves? Like I said before, speaking the truth is the most important thing in the world. The reason that I wanted to focus so much on this is because, my specialty is in apologetics. It's about providing arguments for the faith. And so often what my job is giving people the right answers or helping them think through opposing arguments and objections and how to respond and so on. And that's a good thing to do. It's a good thing to do. But I really don't think it's what's holding us back. I think that often we have the answers. I think that often we know what to say. I think often we know. It's simple too. We don't need to be overly brilliant. We know the truth can be very simple. It's not knowing what to say. It's speaking it all. I think that's what's holding us back. We don't need more information. We need more courage. It is the most important thing in the world because tyrannies are empires of lies. All of those examples that I brought up by starting this with the sexual revolution, with different political crises that we see, with the tragedy, the increasing tragedy that abortion and the abortion industry is becoming. All of these things are tyrannies that are invading and working at taking over the lives of people. You see, it's not just political talking points that we're discussing here. It is very literally life and death. It is very literally the trajectory of a society, the life and death of a society, of a generation. And even an ideological tyranny, like a real tyranny, is built upon lies. This is why speaking the truth, every individual deciding to stand up and speak the truth, is so important. There was a German pastor during the rise of the Nazi Party in World War II named Martin Niemöller. He said, "First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionist, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." Speak with courage. I guarantee that you guys probably already know what to say. At least a simple answer. You probably already know what to say in the specific issues that you guys are facing on your campuses. in your classrooms. Once again, it does not have to be out of this world brilliant, stop any kind of response that someone could have. There's no such thing like an answer. There's no such thing like an answer like that. You guys probably already know what to say. It just comes down to actually speaking. I think many of us are held back often because there's this stereotype of the angry evangelical or the judgmental Christian, right? We've all heard of that. We're all aware of that stereotype of that. I mean, and it's a stereotype because there are people out there like that, right? They've encountered something. Quite honestly, I haven't encountered that many. I know myself, and I'm not angry, and I'm not bigoted or hateful or judgmental towards anyone as far as I know. And all my friends, that doesn't describe them. My family, that doesn't describe them. My friends who are at other churches, that doesn't describe them. You see what I'm getting at here is that the stereotype is describing a very, very small, but very vocal minority. But what if the rest of us would just start speaking up? How fast would that stereotype change? The rest of us who aren't angry, who aren't hateful or judgmental, or who aren't using our Christianity as a club, but as an invitation to redemption, hope, and freedom. What if we just simply spoke up? How quickly would that narrative change? You see, boldly, courageously speaking the truth is not about your rightness. It is about rescuing people from lies. As I said before, this can literally be an issue of life and death. And once again, as we are seeing with new legislation being passed, allowing infanticide, with the suicide crisis, with those who are suffering gender dysphoria, being told very harmful narratives that are only increasing the dysphoria, that are only increasing the pain and leading to more self-harm and in many cases suicide. Speaking the truth, even the politically incorrect truth, very might well be life-saving. It is not about rightness. It's about rescuing people from lies. It's not about your eloquence. It's about honesty and boldness. It's not about harshness, but it might be hard. You can speak hard truths. So often the hardest ones to speak are the hard truths, without being harsh. But simply speak. When you're asked, simply answer. When you're given the opportunity, simply speak up and refuse to lie. Here's how to start developing this kind of courage. First, you need to start by being grounded in the truth. Start by being grounded in the truth. You can't speak truth that you don't know. You can't speak truth that you don't embody, that you don't live out. The easiest way to start developing courage in your life is to simply start living a life of integrity. To start making your life match the truths that you claim to believe. Living those things out. Being transparent and honest and self-aware of your own weaknesses, and then not hiding those weaknesses. Be someone who is deeply grounded in the truth. How will you go and wage war without a sword? How will you navigate your way through a chaotic culture? How will you navigate your way through dark times without a light to guide your feet? A light to guide and a sword are both words that describe the Bible, right? How will you have the energy to endure and to persevere without the nourishment of daily bread? Be grounded in the truth. I know that it's not something extremely profound, but guys, it really does simply come down to just read this thing. Be grounded in the truth. Secondly, be ready to wage war when necessary. Now let me clarify, not against people. Our war, our battle is not against people. And as we need to understand very often, the people that we encounter are caught up in the tyranny of lies. right? They are deceived themselves. And so even whenever we are in conversations, discussions, debates, where they may be, our issue is not with the person, but with the stronghold of sin, of Satan, of evil that is over their lives, and trying to help them see the light. But be ready to wage war with that tyranny of evil, with that empire of darkness. In 2 Corinthians 10, 3-5, Paul said, "For although we live in the flesh, we do not wage war according to the flesh, since the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but are powerful through God for the demolition of strongholds. We demolish arguments," see, not people. "We demolish arguments and every proud thing," or as the ESV says, every lofty opinion that is raised up against the knowledge of God, and we take every thought captive to obey Christ. Be ready to wage war. Do not let timidity or what somebody tells you about niceness to hold you back. Paul said we demolish strongholds. He goes on to say we will destroy every argument. Courage might require you to be a little bit less nice. But wage war against the strongholds, against the arguments, against the lofty opinions, for the sake of people. So when you wage war, you're gentle with the person, right? And hard against the lie. You stand firm in the truth, but you smile at the individual made in the image of God who stands before you, right? So be grounded in the truth. Be ready to wage war. Here's another practical thing that you can do. Begin to speak the truth all the time. Cut out all the white lies of your life. I'm talking about the most harmless of lies that you think you're living with. Just things like whenever you tend to be late for something, right? How often do we come up with just a little white lie for why we're late? Maybe why you're bailing on plans with somebody, whatever else it may be, why you forgot an assignment for a class that you're in. Whatever else it is, okay, I'm talking just mundane stuff. Wipe out lies from your life. Wipe them out. Give up the white lies. Give up the half-truths. Give up the silence that you choose rather than speaking when you know you ought to speak. And once again, I'm talking about the small thing, guys. The small things. Do you have a friend that does something that just really hurts you or gets at you and is causing you to start to become resentful against that person? It could be a friend, it could be a family member. That's a sign you need to say something. If it's causing resentment, you need to speak up. You need to say something. It doesn't mean come down on them with an iron fist or a hammer. Okay, but it just means say something. Okay, and that little bit of boldness over time, living honestly, is going to work up courage in you. Live with greater integrity in your life. Then whenever the time comes for you to speak, whenever the time comes for you to give a hard answer to someone who asks, to share your story, whatever else it may be, you'll be more equipped and you'll be more ready because that courage muscle has been trained and tested and tried, and it's a little bit stronger than it used to be. You need to begin to live this way today. You need to start living this way today. It's not something to put off. It's not something that you can choose to opt out of because it doesn't matter in your life. Because we might be asking ourselves, maybe some of you are inspired. I don't know, maybe none of you are inspired. Maybe some of you are thinking, well, what does it matter if I speak with courage? You know, there's plenty of others in this room, and there's plenty of others in this city, or in the church in America, or the church of the West, the global church. There's plenty of other people who can speak up, and they can do it better than me, right? They're smarter than me, they're more eloquent than me. Why does it matter? What difference can I make? Do not underestimate the difference that one individual can make. There was a time whenever the Egyptian Empire was the strongest power on earth. And there was no one higher on earth than Pharaoh. There was no one with more power, with more authority, with more influence than Pharaoh. And yet, his empire was defeated by the actions of one courageous, defiant mother. For whenever he decreed that all Hebrew boys at a certain age should be killed, what did she do? This one individual, what did she do? She defied him. She stood strong. She stood by what she knew was right rather than giving into fear. She stood by faith in her God rather than giving into the supposed power of this Pharaoh, of this emperor, this dictator, this tyrant. And because she refused, that boy, that Moses, went on to be the one who would deliver that nation from slavery. We might look at Moses as the hero. He was a hero to a point. But it all started with one mother, and we don't even know her name. Think of Martin Luther, one man who stood up against a religious empire. One man who stood choosing the right thing whenever it would have been just, I'm sure everything in him was pushing him to take the easy way out. The one who chose to stand on what is right instead of confess what is wrong. This one man, Luther, stood against a religious empire, and he literally changed the world. He changed the world with a few simple words. Whenever they were pressuring him to recant, to change, he said, "Here I stand." Don't underestimate the power of one individual, even an individual in here standing. Think of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer was a pastor in Germany at the same time as Niemöller. He was a pastor and theologian during the rise of the Nazis in Germany. Niemöller was initially enthusiastic about the Nazis. He didn't see through their propaganda. Bonhoeffer did. He saw through their propaganda right from the beginning, and from the earliest moments of Hitler's arrival on the public scene through his rises of power, Bonhoeffer was at the front lines of the resistance, refusing to take the easy way out, refusing to be silent whenever everyone was trying to tell him to stop talking, to stop speaking out against them. They even tried sending him to America so that he would be safe. You know how long he lasted over here? 2 weeks. He couldn't stand it. He had to be back with his people. He had to be back preaching. He had to be back speaking against that empire of lies. And he lost his life for it. And now he stands as a great inspiration to us. Do not underestimate the power of one individual standing courageously, speaking with integrity. Because your courage also might inspire others. What if it just took one person to stand, to speak? Even you, whenever you think that your words would be so insignificant, but you have no idea the blazing fire that God could bring from one little spark. You don't know what plans God has for you whenever you speak. The poet John Donne wrote, "What if the present were the world's last night?" I've been reading C.S. Lewis's essay called The World's Last Night based off of that line. It's been making me think about that. What if the present were the world's last night? If this present we're living in right now, if this was the world's last night, would the courage with which you've been living today make you proud? Would the courage with which you've been living today be the kind that you could look at and say would be described as lion-hearted? Would it be the kind of courage that you could look at and say is the kind of courage that a person acts in whenever they hear God say, "Be strong and courageous," and they answer that calling? Let me call all of us. Do not cower in fear, but stand in the light. And then maybe people will look back at our generation, at our time, and say this was their finest hour.